We are told the aversion to the number 13 is a superstition, that it is irrational, a relic of pre-scientific thinking, something modern culture has mostly outgrown. The standard explanation places its origin somewhere in religious tradition, a count of figures at a final supper, a mythological tally of Norse gods, simple stories for a simple fear. The official consensus is that 13 became unlucky through narrative repetition, and that over centuries, that repetition hardened into cultural habit. That explanation is tidy. It is also incomplete. What the standard account does not address is the precision with which 13 was excluded, not feared, but structurally removed from some of the oldest organizational systems on record. The question worth examining is not why people found the number unsettling, but why institutions, architects, calendar makers, and urban planners across unconnected civilizations quietly and consistently built systems that stopped at 12. Look at the calendar. The Gregorian system and the Julian before it operates on 12 months. The Babylonian calendar before that, 12 months. The Egyptian civil calendar, 12 months of 30 days each, with a remainder period set apart. The Sumerian system used 12 as a base unit. The Chinese traditional calendar organizes its cycle through 12 years. These are not neighboring cultures sharing a tradition. They are separated by thousands of miles, and in some cases, thousands of years. The standard explanation is that 12 divides cleanly into halves, thirds, quarters, and sixths, and so it was a practical choice. That is plausible. But it does not explain why the transition from 12 to 13 was not simply treated as an overflow, the way we handle a 13th item today. Instead, the 13th unit was structurally excluded. In many systems, a 13th month was considered a correction, an aberration, something inserted only when the mathematics demanded it and then quietly removed. The 13th was not just the next number. It was treated as outside the system. The question that arises is whether this was independently arrived at, or whether it reflects a shared prior framework that has not been fully accounted for. Consider the architectural record. The clock face with 12 positions is so universal that we rarely think to ask why it stops where it does. The answer given is that 12 divides into the natural cycle of day and night. But this does not explain why 13 divisions would have been structurally worse. A 13-hour clock is mathematically awkward only if you are already committed to dividing the day in half. That commitment itself requires explanation. Move into physical structures. Many of the oldest surviving buildings in Europe and the Near East have their primary divisions, columns, arches, interior bays, organized in multiples of 12. Not always, but with a frequency that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. In several surviving medieval guild halls and administrative buildings, 13 was not used as a count for anything functional. Floor plans that required 13 units would be adjusted. A corridor widened, a room removed, the number brought back to 12 or pushed to 14. Documentation of this practice is incomplete, but the pattern appears in architectural records across different countries and centuries. The official explanation is that this was superstition driving design choices. That may be true. But it also means the avoidance of 13 was so deeply embedded that it shaped the physical environment, not just the beliefs of individuals, but the buildings they lived and worked in. That is a different order of magnitude from a cultural fear. The number 12 appears as a structural unit in measurement systems that had no known contact with one another. The imperial system of inches uses 12 as its primary subdivision. The Mesopotamian sexagesimal system, base 60, is divisible by 12 and was used for both time and angular measurement. The ancient Chinese system of pitch pipes used 12 as the organizing count. The 12 tones of Western music theory, which became standard by the 17th century, mirror a structure that appears in much older musical frameworks from different parts of the world. Each of these can be explained independently. 12 is a highly composite number. It divides cleanly in more ways than any smaller integer. Practical convenience explains some of the convergence. But the sheer consistency, across measurement, time, space, music, architecture, and governance, suggests either a remarkable coincidence of independent reasoning, or the inheritance of a prior organizational framework that these systems were all drawing from, whether or not they knew it. What is difficult to account for is the consistency of the exclusion, not just the consistency of 12 itself. In the Norse mythological tradition, the story commonly cited to explain 13's association with bad fortune involves 12 gods gathered at a feast, disrupted by the arrival of a 13th. In Christian tradition, 12 apostles are counted, with the 13th figure at the table, Judas, becoming the symbol of betrayal. In both cases, notice the structure. 12 is the complete, stable count. 13 is the intrusion that breaks the system. This narrative structure, 12 as wholeness, 13 as disruption, appears too consistently to be coincidence. The question is, which came first, the narrative or the underlying numerical framework it was constructed to explain? If cultures were already organizing around 12, the stories about 13 as disruptive may have emerged to rationalize a pre-existing structural choice. The mythology may be descriptive rather than causal. If that is the case, then asking why 13 is feared misses the more interesting question. Why was 12 so universally chosen as the ceiling of complete systems? There is a further anomaly in the historical record that receives limited attention. Several pre-modern administrative systems used a 13-unit framework internally, but never externally. Certain ancient Egyptian ritual counts, some Mesoamerican calendrical cycles, and specific Vedic organizational frameworks incorporated 13 as an esoteric or internal number, used by specialists. Not publicized in public-facing systems. The Mayan Tzolk'in calendar uses a cycle of 13 in combination with a cycle of 20. The Hebrew calendar uses a 13th month in leap years, but treats it as an insertion, not a standard unit. The pattern that emerges is not simple fear of 13, but a consistent division between exoteric systems, the public, practical frameworks of time, space, and governance, which stopped at 12, and esoteric or specialized systems that incorporated 13 as a hidden or internal count. This bifurcation appears across cultures that had no documented contact. The official explanation does not account for this distinction. The claim that 13 is simply unlucky does not explain why it would be systematically excluded from public frameworks while being quietly retained in specialized ones. Consider the organizations that maintained numerical symbolism as an explicit part of their structure. Freemasonry, as one documented example, organizes certain degrees and symbolic frameworks around both 12 and 33, with 13 occupying a transitional position in some of its internal records. The Knights Templar, historically, operated with 13 as a structurally significant count in several of their organizational arrangements. The arrest of the Templars on Friday, October 13, 1307, the event most commonly cited as the origin of Friday the 13th, raises a question that the historical record leaves open. Was the date chosen arbitrarily, or was it selected because of its numerical significance to the order being suppressed? There is no documentary evidence that the date was chosen symbolically, but there is also no detailed account of how it was selected. What is documented is that the action was coordinated across multiple regions simultaneously, an unusual logistical feat for the era, suggesting careful planning over an extended period. Whether the date was incidental or chosen remains unresolved. The question worth noting is not whether this was a conspiracy. It is whether numerical symbolism was an operational consideration for groups that understood it as such, and whether its removal from public systems had a function beyond mere superstition. In the United States, the number 13 occupies an unusual dual position. The original 13 colonies are treated as foundational. The number is displayed on the seal, on the flag, in official iconography. 13 stripes, 13 arrows, 13 stars in the original design. The Great Seal of the United States contains 13 at nearly every level of its structure. Yet simultaneously, 13 is avoided in building floors, hotel rooms, and public numbering systems at a rate unmatched by any other number. A country that built its founding identity around 13 proceeds to systematically remove it from its built environment. That is a contradiction that the standard historical account, 13 as simply unlucky, does not resolve. One possibility is that 13 carried a dual significance. It was both the count of origin and the count of disruption. Publicly, it was commemorated as the number of founding units. Privately, in everyday organizational systems, it was treated as a threshold not to be crossed. The founding designers of American symbolic architecture may have been drawing on a tradition that understood 13 differently than the superstition narrative suggests. Whether that tradition has a coherent source that has not been fully identified remains an open question. The measurement of time offers another unresolved inconsistency. The 12-month calendar is so entrenched that proposals to reform it to 13 months, which would produce 13 months of exactly 28 days, plus 1 or 2 extra days, have been advanced and rejected multiple times. The International Fixed Calendar, which organized the year into 13 equal months, was formally proposed in the early 20th century and considered by the League of Nations. It was ultimately rejected not on mathematical grounds. The mathematics were sound, but on cultural ones. The resistance was described as psychological and traditional. The 13-month calendar is, by most mathematical standards, simpler and more regular than the 12-month system. Each month would fall on the same day of the week every year without exception. The practical advantages were acknowledged by its proponents and not meaningfully contested by its opponents. The rejection was framed as resistance to change. But a simpler system replacing a more complex one is not a difficult sell under ordinary circumstances. The consistent resistance to 13 as an organizational unit, even when it is demonstrably more functional, suggests the avoidance has a structural basis that the superstition explanation does not fully capture. What we are left with is a pattern that crosses cultures, centuries, and disciplines. 12 appears as the natural ceiling of public organizational systems. 13 appears either as an intrusion, an esoteric internal count, or a symbol of foundational disruption. The gap between these two positions is consistent enough that it suggests a shared underlying understanding, one that has been passed down through institutions, myths, and physical design rather than through any single documented tradition. The mainstream explanation, that 13 is unlucky because of stories, accounts for the persistence of individual superstition. It does not account for the architectural choices, the calendar structures, the organizational bifurcation, or the mathematical resistance. These are not the behaviors of a culture that finds a number vaguely unsettling. They are the behaviors of a culture that was taught, at some point, to treat a number as structurally significant in a specific way. Where that teaching originated, and whether it preserves knowledge of something older than the traditions we can trace, is not answered by the available record. The number 13 still appears at every level of American foundational iconography. The 13-month calendar mathematics still work. The oldest calendrical systems still stop at 12. The architectural avoidance of 13 still shapes buildings people enter every day, in cities that were designed by people who knew the avoidance was not rational and built it in any way. What is absent is not the evidence of the pattern. What is absent is the explanation for why the pattern exists with the consistency and precision it does across cultures that, by the official account, should not have been making the same structural choice. The number 13 has been with us throughout recorded history. The reasoning behind how it has been treated has not been.